The wind in that desert did not care who it punished. It came with a dry, patient cruelty, carrying grit that bit eyelids and left fine riverbeds of dust across the porch boards. The sun hung low and honest over the broken shingles of the Reyes place, throwing the skeleton of the house into a long, patient shadow. Bones of white paint flaked like old scabs. The roof sagged in one corner where a storm months before had taken a ridge. A dry cistern sat like a dark eye at the side of the corral, and the gate squealed when anything moved it.
Rodrigo Salazar had been wealthy and certain as a closed fist. He had believed in belonging to people the way men in su estación believed in ownership of the land. The record of that life lay in small things she could not show the world: a bruise hidden beneath a sleeve, a tone in his letters that had gradually hardened into command. She never spoke of him when Doña Carmela asked. There are stories that, once told, cinch the throat so tight they become the town's entertainment. Vanessa refused to let her wounds be forage. The first time she felt the baby move so fierce it took her breath away, she stood by the window and watched the horizon. Her hand went to her belly in a move that had been made for centuries, old as the first woman to know the hollows a child could make inside, and the desert answered, quiet and enormous. It was late afternoon when the horse came into view, a ragged silhouette against the sun. Vanessa saw the dust first, then the slow rise and fall of a rider. In San Rafael there were two kinds of men who rode alone: those who had work to find and those who had left everything behind. This rider was the second kind, in the way his hat sat low and his clothes held the echo of different towns stitched into their seams. He pulled up at the gate as if he had been thinking of that precise place for a long time. Guillermo Herrera had been on the road long enough that silence had become his preferred language. He was tall in the way a man is tall when he has carried heavy things: chests of loss, sacks of regret, the memory of a house that burned. He kept his hands on his horse's neck when he dismounted, as if grounding himself to the animal. His face was a map of sun and wind, a jaw wrapped in the shadow of a beard. A medallion dangled beneath his shirt, worn dark with sweat and grief. He did not come as a savior. He came with the gait of someone who had once been a resident of someone else's life, and then, through a single misfortune, had been cast into wandering. His arrival at the Reyes porch was a sudden, private thing. The horse snorted. The boards complained under boots. Vanessa, who had been mending a tear in a shirt with a needle so small it might as well have been hope, looked up. For a long heartbeat there was a question between them, carried by the air. What does a lone man ask on the porch of a pregnant woman in the middle of nowhere? He asked nothing at first. He unrolled a blanket across one of the sagging chairs and sat a little too still. When he finally spoke, his voice came from under the brim of the hat and had the edge of a man unused to asking favors. "The spring is dry," he said. "Figured I could spare a bottle." Vanessa regarded him as one sizes up a winter storm. "We have water," she said. The thread in her hand stilled. The wind threatened to pull the hair from her head in careless fingers. "You look like you could use the same." Guillermo tipped his head, a small, customary kind of deference.
He did not offer his name. Pride kept it folded back like a cart. "Suit myself," he said, and produced a tin canteen. He watched the house with a particular courtesy, noting the way the flue leaned and where mice had found the warmest hiding places. Vanessa found herself aware of him as she had not been of anyone in a long time. It was a sensation like someone opening a window in a room you had thought sealed. Something easy and dangerous about that. She told him, when he asked where she had come from, that she had come to the empty place her uncle had left her. She did not offer Rodrigo's name as a roast to be passed around Doña Carmela's counter. The air between them remained a guarded thing, polite and taut. They had lingered no more than an hour when the first contraction clutched Vanessa. She had learned them as one learns a new language, increasingly, unmistakably. This was not a small spasm. It folded her forward with such force she thought for a second she might break. Guillermo was at her elbow with a hand that felt like a rope thrown in time. It steadied without crowding. "Breathe," he said, and his voice was not a command so much as a steady instrument. She knew every step one could take alone. She had intended to be alone, but the house was small. There is a particular terror to being large with child and small without help. The contractions came in a measured, remorseless rhythm. The mind, in those seconds between shock and reaction, performs a rapid arithmetic of tasks.
Get water, warm a cloth, find fresh sheets, make a fire in the stove. Guillermo moved as if he knew these small mercies, the tilt of a pot, the choice of a blanket. He was deft with his hands. They had a way of working that had nothing to do with words, and Vanessa watched the chords in his knuckles as they closed and opened. Outside, the sky browned with evening. The wind thinned and sharpened, carrying a smell of sage. Inside, Vanessa lined up the things she thought would be necessary. She had read and been taught, and had learned in the telling that there were rules. This was not the place for reverie. This was for doing. There came a moment, sudden and bright and terrible, when she had to lie down. The house seemed to holler and swell, and then shrink to the size of the bed. She clung to the linen as if it were a rope. The needle slipped from her fingers and rolled beneath the bed. Guillermo fetched it with his boot without thinking of it as theft. He told her, in low sentences, how to handle the pain. "Think of a steady place," he said, "like the riverbank where the willow holds tight." He was a stranger whose voice had the improbable kind of gentleness reserved for people who have seen worse and learned to temper their hands. When the labor intensified, he became a structure. He boiled water until the kettle hissed like a scolding neighbor, and laid clean cloths across the table. He fanned the stove while she breathed through the surges.
He brought coffee in a tin cup, and when she refused it, kept the cup between his palms as if a prayer were lodged inside. He called to himself, once only, his own name, Guillermo, like someone renaming himself, and it settled into the room like a new piece of furniture. Vanessa's memory of the birth would later be a mosaic of little things: the smell of antiseptic soap tinting the air, the way the oil lamp guttered when the wind frowned a draft, the palm of a man, someone's, pressing against her back at a certain angle that made the pain less unbearable. She remembered a lullaby in Spanish that she could not place the origin of, words in her own mother's tongue she had not sung since she was a girl, and this combination of the new and remembered steadied her. Pain sharpened her focus to a single line of work: deliver the child. Pain, oddly, made the world narrower and clearer. The house had been lined with the kind of silence that holds more than it gives away. Now it filled with grunts and breath and occasional profanity, Guillermo's, said like punctuation. He never let her be alone. Between one contraction and the next, he would murmur small instructions: change your position, find the breath, make a sound like a wordless thing, and let it pass. He had a hand that found the small of her back when the contractions folded her like paper, and a finger that drummed a slow cadence on the bed frame to keep her breathing even. At some point, with the lamp burning low and the night a black sheet full of indifferent stars, Vanessa felt the last pressure. The pain peaked and then eased beneath a kind of fierce, blossoming hush. Something slid free, and then was held with the cautious reverence of a thing both living and fragile. Guillermo, who had never been a midwife by trade, cradled the child as one handles a bird with a snapped wing, gentle, careful, eyes quick for signs. The first cry was a small, stubborn sound, as if the child were insisting upon existence. Vanessa felt it like a new chord in her chest. A portion of the past fell away instantly. The room, which had been all practicalities and grit, changed its name to home with that single sound. Guillermo's face, usually a map of impassibility, softened in a way that frightened and steadied her. He looked like a man who had seen a thing forgiven at last. They wrapped the baby in a blanket that smelled of flour and fire and the faint perfume of lavender Vanessa kept for her hair. The child's skin was the color of warm bread. He opened his eyes once, black and luminous, and then closed them, content for the strange warmth and the sound of human breathing. "What will you call him?" Guillermo asked, and the question came out of a place that had hoarded questions for a long time. He had an economy of words. When he used one, it was heavy and meaningful. Vanessa considered it as she felt the new, raw tenderness of being a mother. Names are small miracles. How you call someone can be a sort of blessing.
She had thought of names in the past, like prayers left unsaid. The name that came now was simple and stubborn, a name that felt like a promise without bargaining. "Mateo," she said, and the sound of it was like setting down a stone in water. it rippled outward. Her voice, still raw from labor, carried a small private triumph. Guillermo's mouth twitched. Mateo, he repeated, as if learning a new word of a language he had forgotten. He stayed awake most of that night, sitting in the doorway with his back to the last light, smoking a cigarette in that slow way people use to mark a vigil. He had a habit of rubbing the inside of his wrist with his thumb, and there the medallion rested, pressed against old grief. He did not remove it, though it was clear it ached him to. He had been a man who ran when the fire came. He had kept his fleeing as a kind of litany, telling himself he could atone for absence with distance. The sight of the child made distance feel like an impossible lie. They learned to breathe together. It was a phrase Vanessa would remember and tell no one, though it could have been carved as a marker over the whole of what followed. When the acute part passed, and the house settled into a fatigue that was almost holy, Guillermo fetched blankets and filled a crock-pot with the best he could muster from her supplies, finding in the small things a competence she had not expected. He boiled water and washed the sheets with a hand that trembled when she thought she could not see. He fashioned a sling of sorts from an old scarf so she could nurse without laying back entirely, and he adjusted the light so it would not glare like accusation. Vanessa watched him in the way people study a horse's gait, the attention of someone noting what is true. She saw him wake in the middle of the night and bring more wood, saw him stand in the doorway the next morning, watching as if the horizon might deliver something they both feared. He taught her to hold the baby when the infant fidgeted, his fingers aligning her hands like an instructor's. There was a clumsy beauty in it, two people who had known loss, forming a map where they could move without retracing old, dangerous roads. News spreads in small towns in a way that townsfolk sometimes forget. It moves like smoke, finding every fold and corner and deciding what to show. By the time the second day had ended, San Rafael's gossip had been busy. Doña Carmela saw the makeshift cradle when she came to bring more flour, and did not talk of Rodrigo's claims because the sight of the child altered her. The sheriff came by, ostensibly to make a record, but his questions slid awkwardly, revealing an uncertainty about whether he should treat this as a case or a private tragedy. Don Felipe came and sat on the porch in a sun-worn chair, and when Vanessa offered to take his coat, he waved away the formality and put out his hand to the infant like an honest benediction. The town's voices were not a single thing.
Some of them still held a thread of suspicion. Doña Carmela had not been entirely shaken of her habit, but many of them reframed their judgment when held against a helpless, newly born baby. The town had loved children for the obvious reason that children force adults to choose the shape they prefer for the future. A baby did not ask for stories. He arrived and made a demand of the present. Guillermo moved through the days with a particular patience. He had been a man who knew how to set a fence, to shoe a horse, to gut a rabbit and cook it with herbs found along a dry stream. He had been a man who wore his silence like armor and had kept a steady pace on the road until fate and grief had hollowed him out. The tasks he performed at the ranch were, at first, clerical. He raised a slat on the roof where the rain leaked, repaired a gate that had sagged and been useless to a herd, fixed hinges until the door no longer complained when it closed. But each of these, carefully completed, changed the house by degrees. The roof no longer took on its small, damp sorrow. The gate closed with a new certainty. Vanessa watched him at these tasks and found, slowly, that the house was changing not only on the outside but within her. There was a steadier heartbeat to the child sleeping. The milk came when it should. She taught him how to soothe a fretful baby by rocking and humming an old lullaby. Guillermo listened and learned the words in a low voice, and then sang them himself when he thought she had slept. It was an act of courage to sing, and the desert answered with a wind that had less cruelty in it, at least for the minutes of his song. In the small hours, when the baby had been fed and the lamp had burned halfway to the end of its wick, they shared fragments of their lives like travelers exchange tobacco. Guillermo would allow, in those low moments, for the smallest of confessions. He told Vanessa once of a house that had burned. "It was snowing where I'd been," he said, and Vanessa frowned because snow did not sit well in their landscape. He laughed softly at her confusion and explained that it was years before.
and that weather had been unkind in a way that made the mind fold in on itself. "I left," he said, and the word was a small stone. He had not been there when the fire took what it took. This was his burden. The medallion he wore, he said, belonged to his wife, and inside it had been a lock of hair the color of wheat. He kept it close because removing it felt like a betrayal, and keeping it close felt like an accusation. Vanessa understood those two things in the way someone understands the map of their own scars. You do not erase them, you learn what weight they carry. She did not press him for detail. There was a line he would not cross himself. Grief, she had learned, has countries and borders you do not overstep.
There were mornings when she would wake and find him outside, tending a small patch where she had thrown seed into the ground on impulse one wet afternoon. He was patient with the soil in a way that made it live. They spoke, sometimes, in small increments, about the moon's color, about the way goats like to lift their heads at noon. Romance in that place did not bloom all at once. It was a work like building a fence, nail by nail, until something kept animals and the weather from having everything. Trust was a similarly constructed thing. The town watched and wondered, and, in some quarters, softened. Don Felipe became a quiet ally, bringing tools and the kind of practical counsel that does not ask for return. He would sit on the porch and read from a battered book at Vanessa's request, pages about the land, about planting, lines of prose that had nothing to do with the precariousness of her situation. It was a small way of making time, of grounding the days in a rhythm that was not terror-driven. Guillermo's secret, not yet voiced in full, muted some of the town's curiosity. He had once been known by men in other counties, men who kept rough records in ledger books. Stories traveled, and with them the knowledge that he had been at one point a man of consequence to some crime or another. He had, for reasons that annoyed him when he thought of them, been labeled a forajido. The sheriff and his deputies sometimes glanced at him with a reserved sort of caution. But there are other kinds of currency in a community besides the law. A man who could mend what was broken could, in time, buy the right to be recognized as useful. Guillermo paid his way in work and quiet. Yet the desert is not a safe place to hide. Secrets are carried by wind as readily as seeds. The story that Vanessa had come with a child was not easily concealed, and for those who wanted to believe old habits, the easy stories where a wealthy man could claim a woman like property, the sight of her with a newborn would only be a thing to seize upon. Rodrigo Salazar's name was a bell that chimed in dark rooms. It was not yet the time for Rodrigo's return. The story required rooms to be warmed, and the child to take small, steady breaths. Guillermo did, for a brief while, think he would not stay. It was an idea he carried like a credit note, a thing he could exchange for safety. Ride, leave at dawn, avoid the law, avoid claims, avoid the town's final judgment. To stay was to stake a claim, to be recognized as the man who would answer for a woman and a child. He had not been a man who answered for many things. He had been a man who left. The night he nearly left, Vanessa woke and found him at the gate, coat heavy on his shoulders, horse light and impatient. The moon had risen, a pale coin, and Guillermo's shadow lay like a thin stripe across the road. He had packed a bag that might have fit in a wagon, and his hand had hesitated on the saddle as if memory were something he could hitch his resolve to and ride off. "You don't have to do this," Vanessa said when she crossed the porch. The words were small but steady. The house listened. He looked at her in a way that seemed to catalog her features, as if they were precious not only for what they were, but for their vulnerability. "I don't plan to be trouble," he said. "I don't plan to make promises I can't keep." In his voice there was a truth he could not disguise. He had been running so long he no longer trusted his own feet. The medallion lay warm and heavy against his chest, like the last tether to a life he had lost. She put a hand on the medallion through his shirt. The skin was warm and calloused. "Mateo will have a father," she said simply. Not a pleading, not a bargain. A statement like the setting of a stone. "If you choose to go, go. I won't stop you. But if you choose to stay..." She did not complete the sentence because some things are too large to name in a small hour. He did not answer at once. The horse shifted its weight. Somewhere down the road a coyote called as if to punctuate the smallness of human choice. Guillermo's hand closed on the medallion, a small, private ceremony, and then he slid the saddle from the horn and set his bag down. The choice, when it settled into his bones, was not dramatic. It arrived as a quiet decision. He would stay until dawn. He said it without speech that needed an audience.
He stayed to see what the day would break into. They learned to breathe together. The house, for the first time since Vanessa had arrived, felt inhabited rather than occupied. It was a small difference, like the difference between a sparrow's call and a person saying hello, and yet it rearranged the days. In the mornings, they tended to tasks with an odd kind of economy. Feed the goats, check the fence, wash the baby's clothes, and hang them so they whispered like flags across the yard. He showed her how to use the plane on a board so the children's cradle would rock true. And still the secret hummed, the one in her belly that had been born into the world as loudly as the small boy's cry, and the one beneath Guillermo's shirt that ached with old grief. There were nights when Vanessa sat with the infant in her lap and thought about the town's mouths, how they would gnaw on the story until it fit hunger. There were mornings when Guillermo went into town for bread and came back with stories about faces and gossip and the sheriff's ambiguous regard. There was always the knowledge that something could come out of the dust and the road and unravel the fragile, hand-stitched piece they had stitched together. On the third morning after Mateo's birth, a woman from the town stood at the edge of the gate, Doña Carmela, with the habit of revealing more than she intended.
She did not come with malice exactly. She came with the motor of curiosity that townsfolk are born with. "A brave thing," she said, eyeing Vanessa with both judgment and a queer sort of admiration. She had a way of speaking that turned friction into spectacle. "You should be careful about men who wander in, you know." Vanessa looked at her and then at Guillermo. There was an implicit question hanging in the air. What would the town do, given cause to choose between the wealthy man's claim and the small cluster of a house-heeled family? Doña Carmela, perchance, meant it as advice. Vanessa meant it as a recognition. The world would not be kind to a woman with a child and a story. Guillermo answered for them both in a few calm sentences about work and honesty and the way one must look after those weaker than oneself. His words were not performed for Doña Carmela's approval so much as they were a small practice of integrity. He left it at that. The woman went away with the seed of a thought. Men in San Rafael had many appetites for spectacle. For once, the spectacle evaporated into the ordinary business of living. They did not speak of Rodrigo Salazar, not in the open. Names have power. To name a man who claims you is to hand him a map. The secret that Rodrigo believed he had possessive rights hummed at the edges of their lives. Vanessa found herself watching the road. Every dust cloud that came over the hills was a little spike of adrenaline. Guillermo noticed her worry and wrapped his hand around hers in a way that made a promise without words. He had not promised many things, but he was starting to accumulate small acts. A repaired gate, a warm cup, the ability to catch a child when she staggered from a contraction that still came now and then in small remnant waves. These were the things by which he was building his defense. The sturdiness of a door, the surety of a set of hands. In time, the town may judge them for who they were. For the moment, they had the house and the infant and one another. The wind changed that night to a gentler thing, as if disappointed by its own cruelty. Guillermo sat with the medallion in his palm and then slid it back into the fold of his shirt. He had not promised he would not run again. He had promised only that he would be present for what was immediately in front of him. That was the frontier's peculiar contract. You make a step and see if the land holds. He had taken that step. He would sleep that night and listen to the baby's breath, and wake on the side of a woman's life he had not been intended to occupy. The future, with all its possible storms, remained on the road. They learned in small ways to trust each other's hands. Guillermo's hands, gnarled and work-marked, taught Vanessa how to coax a stubborn boot back into shape, how to stitch leather so it would hold, how to coax a reluctant fire into life.
Her hands taught him gentleness, how to take a child's cheek and press it without asking permission, how to lay a clean sheet across a mattress with an exactness that kissed the fabric. Hands speak in a language older than promises. They make what words cannot. If there was an answer to the secret that should never have been told, neither of them would say it aloud. Secrets are not solved by pronouncements. They are solved by the daily accumulation of small, honest deeds. For now, the child slept, and the house did not complain. The porch, with its peeling paint and its stubborn door, stood like a small defiance. Outside, the desert kept its own counsel. In the quiet of that evening, when shadows pooled like ink and the lamp burned steady, Guillermo stepped outside and leaned against the fence. He watched the way the stars slid into place.
He took the medallion from beneath his shirt and held it up to the night, the metal catching a reflection like a promise. He did not bury it then, though the thought had visited him like a thief. There were things that must be done in a certain order. He had a child to protect, a woman he was beginning very slowly to love, and a town whose opinion could be changed by the sight of endurance. The medallion would have its time. He folded it back into his chest as if tucking in a letter he could not yet send. Inside, in the small breathing house, Vanessa cradled Mateo and hummed the tune she had heard in the dark hours of labor. Guillermo listened, and when the lullaby ended, found he had learned the words as if they had always been part of him. The desert night stretched and held them. Dawn would bring errands and shingles to fix, and a town that whispered and watched. Dawn would also bring a decision he did not yet know he must make. For the moment, there was a thin, bright curio called the present, the child's chest rising and falling, the clean smell of hot coffee, the steady, unspoken promise that some men can be changed by the mere fact of being needed. They learned, for the first days, to breathe together. They learned in small economies of movement what it took to keep a life from spilling back into the old ways of loss. Days threaded into each other with chores and the careful recalibration of bodies, Vanessa's with a new, fierce tenderness, and Guillermo's with the muscle memory of labor that demands an immediate fix. The cradle became a hinge between them. Nights were measured by the baby's breath, and by the slow, mutual inventiveness of two people discovering how to share a roof. Spring, in that reckoning, was patient, but the desert's patience was not always forgiveness. Seedlings pushed through cracked soil, and then waited for rain that came in small, exacting promises. They planted a row of beans by the well out of stubbornness and hunger. Guillermo dug with hands that had once hoed other men's fields, the dirt packed around his fingertips like a salt of its own.
He learned to time his efforts by Mateo's naps, to bring water in a bucket lined with care, to mend a fence without thinking of the men who had once used fences as borders of greed. Vanessa watched him as she ironed shirts and hummed the lullaby she had learned as a girl. Lo, a cradle for the child and for the house itself. Their routines were the safest kind of conversation, the clack of a needle, the sound of a kettle lifting from embers, the scrape of a plane across wood. Guillermo taught Vanessa to shave a piece of wood until it rocked true for Mateo. She taught him to soften his voice, to call the baby by the small nicknames he developed in the night. They found ways to knot their grief together without pulling loose the seams that would hold them fast. Time, which had been an enemy in both their lives, became instead the slow mending of ordinary tasks. There was a morning when the roof stopped leaking, where the rain had found the rafters' old sore, a night when the door no longer barked when closed, a quiet Sunday when the coffee seemed richer than it had any right to be. Don Felipe came and read aloud from a battered book while Mateo fussed in his lap. They all laughed at the same small joke, and it moved a rumor another inch toward forgetting. Even Doña Carmela, who had found pleasure in the hazardous art of gossip, softened when she saw the child tuck his fist under his chin like a small man. For a while, the town's appetite for spectacle was placated by the simple miracle of warmth. But the road is long, and men carry with them, grafted as like burrs, other people's stories. A rider's shadow can be anything, in need, in malice, in coincidence, and the horizon gives no promises. It was Guillermo who first noticed the change in the town. It happened the way it often does at the edges of towns. A head turned a little too long in the saloon, a telltale silence when a certain name was mentioned. He went to town one morning for nails and lamp oil, the basket on his arm making an ordinary clack against his thigh. San Rafael's main street was a line of sun-bleached planks, and a row of faces that, like birds, turned toward whatever movement came. Rodrigo Salazar was taller in the town's telling than he had been in Vanessa's memory. Rumor had a way of blowing a man up, making his shoulders broader, his voice a thunder. The Rodrigo Guillermo saw that day wore clean boots and a waistcoat that had never known repair. His hair was combed the way men comb hair when they expect attention. He sat outside the general store, propping a cane more as an accessory than necessity, and he had with him a young man who laughed too loud and whose hand stayed close to the butt of a pistol in his hip. The two men carried themselves like landlords in a country where ownership meant not just title, but appetite. Guillermo's heartbeat tightened when the pair moved through the street, and he read the set of Rodrigo's jaw as a man reads weather.
He bought his nails without conversation and left with the weight of the sight behind him like a stone. He wound back across the ridge and rode with speed measured by worry. The road under his horse's hooves lifted dust that tracked his return like a slow thought. When he stepped back through the gate, the porch light was low and the house smelled of soap. Vanessa sat on a blanket with Mateo in her lap, his head heavy with sleep and the small, honest bulk of a child. She looked up and saw the change in him, the way one sees thunder, there and then, impossible to ignore. "There are men in town," he said without preface. His voice, which had been even when he sang the trio of lullabies poorly and with enormous heart, was now a taut cable. Vanessa felt the old animal move in her. Notice, calculate, gather. Rodrigo was there. He had a man with him. She did not flinch at the name. Names had a kind of weight. Pronouncing them was a kind of loading. Instead, she covered Mateo's tiny foot with her thumb and felt for a moment the absoluteness of that small life. "Did he say anything?" she asked. Guillermo shook his head. "Not yet. But he'll be back." They could hear it in the tone. The "he'll be back." As if it were a weather forecast. A certainty of arrival that made no room for argument. That afternoon, they sharpened the most mundane tools of defense, locks on doors that had been loose for years, the placing of a stout post at the stall of the barn, the gathering of fragments of iron that could be used in a pinch. Protection on the frontier was seldom about fortifications, and more about the will to stand and the calculation of neighbors' help. The house, with its new repairs, felt sturdier because of the hands that had made them. But the threat was not a thing you could nail into place. Rodrigo's return came with the usual drama of people determined to stage their authority. He rode up the lane with a swagger that cost him something in dignity, and with a man whose face was set in the kind of loyalty that takes coin and returns obedience. He dismounted in the yard in a way that said he expected pronouncements and perhaps apology. "I have been patient," Rodrigo said, and his voice cut like a rope-pulled taut. He had eyes that could make a woman look small even when she stood clear and tall. He spoke of rights and of promises, of the natural order in which men like him claimed what they believed was theirs. His words were practiced and sharp. Around him, his companion, Miguel, the man with the easy laugh, kept his hand near his gun and his smile at the ready. Vanessa stood with Mateo at her hip, her back straight. She had learned the value of holding an obstinate face against the world, and there was a hardness to her that came from surviving hunger and cold. "You have no right," she answered, simple as a nailed board. "Mateo is mine." Rodrigo's mouth tightened, as if he found that answer ugly and yet oddly amusing.
"You fled from my house like a thief," he said. "You know how this land runs, woman. Children take names. You cannot hide him here forever." The words were not merely a claim. They were an attempt to make a public fact out of private violence. Guillermo stood between them like a slow-moving barricade, a man whose very posture had learned placement. He did not waste breath in flight. "He's not yours to take," he said. There was a steadiness in it that felt like a promise, and it changed something in the yard. Rodrigo laughed with the light cruelty of the entitled. "And who are you?" he said. "A wanderer? A gate-mender? Men like me know how to make the law walk the way we desire." He looked toward the road in an unwilling expectation. "Sheriff will agree. He knows me. He knows my standing." "Sheriff might know you," Guillermo said, "but he also knows people. And Don Felipe, he knows the truth of a child more than he knows pounds and titles." There it was, the quiet invocation of town weight and the refusal to be cowed by braggadocio. Rodrigo's response was to spit a contempt that caught in the dust. For a space that stretched longer than it should have, Rodrigo argued and Guillermo held a measured line. Words are often the first battle in a fight where men will later trade steel. There were insults traded and veiled threats thrown. They both knew, down to their bones, how conversations could pivot to a pistol. The threat was a shadow. When Rodrigo finally turned away, it was not because he had been convinced, but because his patience had reset. He would return with law or with men who thought themselves law.
The town, which had watched earlier gossip compress into a softer pity, now met news of Rodrigo's claim with a pall of tension. The saloon felt a little thicker that night, the conversations edged with a new watchfulness. Don Felipe called a meeting at his porch the following afternoon, and a handful of men, some with the square jaw of stockmen, others with the softer faces of those who traded at market, came to hear and to decide whether they would stand or brook the weight of Rodrigo's claim. They argued with the slow, argumentative cadence of a town with time and vested interest. Don Carmela spat words like impatient seeds, insisting that order be kept, that property rights mattered in a land where property could mean survival. If we let one man make law from a sticky pride, she insisted, we are done. Others were more sympathetic to the idea that a wealthy man could demand right to a child, because their own calculation of life was often measured in coin and connections. Don Felipe listened, his chin in his hand, and when he finally spoke, he did so with the kind of moral gravity that had always buoyed his voice. We do not take children from mothers who are keeping them fed, he said, not when a neighbor stands to help. If we let money buy a man's conscience over a child's life, what have we left?
His words were not offered as an ultimatum. They were a moral bell rung in the town's center. Men shifted in their chairs. The sheriff sat with his hat in his lap, the expression of a man who kept a ledger with the law on one side and the trouble of enforcing it on the other. He was tempted by rewards and by bureaucratic coherency. If Rodrigo had documents, and Rodrigo had a knack for neat papers and persuasive friends, then the sheriff might have cause to act. But the sheriff's office was also where a man must weigh what is right against what keeps his job simple. It takes a particular courage to step against the favored man in a county. Don Felipe's opinion carried an anchor of weight. The debate was interrupted by an incident that would increase the stakes. Miguel, Rodrigo's companion, brash and hot-tempered, moved at night among the ranch's edges, cutting a horse's halter and chasing a young goat across the yard. He took the action as a demonstration. Guillermo, who had been sleeping across from the window, saw Miguel and took to his feet like a man answering an alarm bell. He walked out with a lantern and a voice that did not ask for name or excuse, but for the straightforwardness of the law of the place. "You've no right to provoke," Guillermo said. Miguel laughed in a way that was close to a snarl. The two men faced each other the way two weathered trees bear the wind, resigned to the strain. When Miguel brought his hand toward his hip, Guillermo moved on instinct. He was not interested in a duel of reputation. He was moving to stop a bully from making a claim on those who could not fight. Gunfire is a brief business on the prairie, long in aftermath, but the flash and the sound measure a heartbeat. Miguel fell, a sudden cessation, and his red sputter was a small, terrible punctuation. He did not die with grandeur. He crumpled like a man cut down by his own cunning. What followed was the law's complicated spindle. Miguel's death made the affair no longer a private quarrel, but a public calamity. Rodrigo, enraged and grief-stricken, cried vengeance and made a spectacle out of the accusation. He threatened with words that tasted of ruin. The sheriff came, the words about self-defense flew, and the town's earlier debates bent under the weight of immediacy. Some men said Guillermo had acted in defense, Miguel had been the aggressor, and Miguel had a hand on his gun. Others whispered that it was the way of itinerant men to make trouble. As the town watched, the balance shifted away from the simplicity of Rodrigo's claims. Guillermo, who had never wanted spectacle or to be the focus of a legal ledger, found himself the center of conversation, as if he had been a star whose orbit could not be changed. There was anger in Rodrigo that braided with the sharpness of entitlement. He demanded justice and named Guillermo a murderer in the language of men who meant to send a man away. Guillermo, for his part, did not flee.
The wound that had once forced him into wandering had taught him the cost of running. He refused to trade a child's safety for his old habit. When the sheriff looked at him, the answer that rose to Guillermo's lips was not plea, but a counteroffer. "If it's a debt the law wants," Guillermo said, blood still warm on his knuckles and the ache of the fight in his shoulder, "then take me. If turning me in pays his pride, then let it be that. But leave Vanessa and the child. I will ride and take my name if that is the price." There was an honesty in it that was a kind of currency. He offered himself as a shield in an attempt to auction away danger.
A man's willingness to be taken is an old frontier currency, used in the place where law, pride, and conscience rub hard against each other. The sheriff, who had weighed reward and reputation before, looked at Guillermo and then at Rodrigo and felt the grind of a law that could not cleanly reconcile with what felt right. There were papers Rodrigo could show to claim paternity, in an ugly legal method of demanding a child be returned to a father who never had to feed or change a diaper. There was also the town's witness, the commonality of hands, and Don Felipe's steady insistence on decency. The sheriff had to decide whether to be an extension of a county ledger or a keeper of a community's fragile justice. The decision fell not on him alone. People moved in the town like a slow current. They had to choose whether to protect an ordinary patched family or to bow to the claim of a man whose wealth made men listen. Women from the market came quietly to the ranch and stood at the fence, speaking low and practical truths. A child needs a breast and a blanket, one said, the kind of statement that has the brute force of common sense. A man can have paper, another said, but he can't stitch a quilt's warmth into a baby's life. It was the plainness of their arguments that mattered. Rodrigo raged like a man who felt his edges turn sharply against him. He wanted justice as men who are used to getting their own way demanded. He demanded a trial, and he demanded that the law do what he said. The town, however, did not fall so easily into that shape. Don Felipe, the sheriff, and other voices gathered testimony. Miguel's proven aggression, the context of the assault, the testimony of neighbors who had watched Rodrigo's manner in town. A conclusion, slow and not entirely clean, revealed itself. Miguel had been the assailant, Guillermo had acted in defense of a family, and Rodrigo's claim to the child, even if steeped in his own certainty, was not an immediate, uncomplicated legal certainty. Rodrigo, enraged, turned to a final recourse. Law that fails to move a man's appetite toward satisfaction too often redirects his appetite towards violence. He said he would take the child by force if the law would not serve him.
He charged the house as if the yard were his right and not a place belonging to those who had remained to make a home. Violence returned as a shorter, angrier thing, a single volley from a man who wished to be noticed, a recoil of an arm that sought to body forth a law he had verbally petitioned, but which reality now refused him. In that sweep of fury, Rodrigo's henchman, one of the men who had followed him in thirst for reward, fell under the measure of a man who had been pushed into the hard edge of necessity. The man did not die with any noble cause. He collapsed like someone who had misjudged his capacity to fight a family's quiet will to survive. The moment after the shouting was the long, terrible stillness. Men assessed bodies, clasped wounds, and watched as the sheriff took names and made notes. Rodrigo, furious and humiliated, found himself handcuffed for the first time in public, with the look of a man whose pride had been paradoxically amplified in shame. He was taken toward the low jail at the edge of town, under the care of the sheriff, who, having seen the evidence and the town's witnesses, had to make a lawful decision. The sheriff's face was pale and a little raw. He had swallowed a choice that would not sit comfortably in his ledger for years to come. He had made a judgment. Rodrigo would answer for the violence he had unleashed and the threats he had made. Guillermo, who had been bandaged under Vanessa's watchful hands, was taken to Don Felipe's parlor with a care that was almost reverent. They cleaned his wound and packed it with boiled cloth. The frontier's medicine is a patient thing, more about hygiene and binding than about the surgical theater. He bled red and steady, and the pain walked with him like an old friend. He refused to move from the house to the infirmary. He refused because the house was now the place that must be defended and tended. That night, while the town argued and paper and witness settled into the legal apparatus, Rodrigo sat in a cell and plotted, because men of his temperament always plot in such circumstances. He called upon his friends and his resources, and he sought to claw back the thing he believed was his. But the town had tilted, as towns do, to the side of common decency when it was clear that a man had acted to protect a child and a woman who had nothing but the life she had made for herself and the help of a man who had chosen to stay. The sheriff, who had been tempted by the easy enforcement of papers and titles, found himself balancing the scales with a moral weight he had not expected to need in his ledger. He had looked at Guillermo's steady hands and at Don Felipe's speech, and at the line of listeners who had arrived at the ranch to speak plainly, and he had decided to enforce not merely the letter of cold law, but the town's conscience. After the trial deliberations and the slow counting of statements, Rodrigo was indicted for the violent threats and the man's death. He was required to stand trial in a county seat where law was less susceptible to the tiny personal economies of frontier feeling, and the sheriff organized his removal. In the weeks that followed, Rodrigo's claims to paternity were scheduled to be contested in a manner that took a long, uneasy time. The town watched as a man accustomed to buying things tried to purchase his way out of an act that had been, for too long, wrapped in his entitlement. Guillermo offered himself as a shield and a possible trade for Vanessa's safety, found the legal outcome more merciful than he had any right to expect. The death of Rodrigo's henchman complicated Rodrigo's demands. The sheriff, who had initially been blinded by official forms of rank and preference, had been swayed by people whose common sense had weight. Women who spoke of feeding a baby, men like Don Felipe who spoke of neighborly obligations, and the simple truth that a child was being kept by those who had shown they would care for him. The law, which had once looked like a scythe aimed at the weak, now shaped into a safety that protected the child and the mother. When the week's fever settled into a determinate decision, Guillermo was offered a chance by the sheriff, a quiet, paper-quiet option to leave the county with no charges pressed. The law could have chosen to pin the death on a struggle with hired men and to let matters rest for a man who had killed in defense. It would have been an easy way to tidy loose ends. For a man like Guillermo, who had once fled from a fire and then from his own guilt, the offer to leave would have appealed to the muscle that had taught him to move away from trouble. The sheriff, sympathetic and weary, hinted that a way out might be good for his reputation and might keep his ledger safe. Guillermo, whose hands were still warm from bandages, and whose shoulder had been given the care of boiled water and the practical stitches of frontier medicine, considered briefly the ancient currency of flight. He thought of the medallion under his shirt, of the old life burned to cinder in memory, and of what it meant to run from pain rather than bear it. He thought, too, of the small face of Mateo and the particular gravity of a man's decision in a child's life. "You could go," Vanessa said one evening, as she sat by his bed with a small lamp close enough to read the corner of the worn book Don Felipe had left them. The room had a neatness that had been earned. "You could ride when they are done and find other roads." Guillermo looked at her in a way he had not known to look before. Not the look of a man memorizing courage or distance, but the look of a man appraising the possibility of belonging. "If I go," he said, and the words came from a place tempered by older fires, "I leave a woman who has no recourse, and a child whose life will be in hands I cannot trust." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I thought running would be enough to atone. It never was."
Vanessa's hand sought his and found it, the way a small anchor finds a mooring. "Then stay," she said softly, and there was no plea in her voice, only an invitation. "Not because you owe me anything that will undo the past, but because this is a house that needs hands and heart. We will build, and sometimes that is what a man can do." So Guillermo decided. He made his choice not as a single theatrical pronouncement, but as a continued series of small acts. He accepted the sheriff's talk of distance, but declined it. He took his place on the porch, as if the world had given him a job, and he worked it. The town's judgments loosened their edge, not only because the law had cleared them. They loosened because the presence of a man who repaired what was broken and rocked a cradle is a persuasive argument. People everywhere are persuaded by the work of living. There came then a ritual that had wanted to be performed for years, the burial of the medallion. Guillermo had carried the small circle of metal close to his skin for a long time, as if the weight was a memory and an accusation in one. It had been his tether to the life he had lost, and to the people he held responsible for the fragment of flame that had reaped what had been his. He sat one morning in the nursery and held the medallion up to the light. It did not gleam with promise. It was an object of memory. "You can keep it if you need," Vanessa said. Her voice had acquired a quiet trust. "Or bury it. Keep what you must, but do not be tethered by what you cannot change." Guillermo walked to the back of the yard, where the old wall was, and where a soft hollow of earth had been formed by the house's age. He dug with a steady hand, and each scoop was a small confession. He placed the medallion in the pate and covered it with soil with the same methodical care he used to mend a hinge. There was nothing theatrical,
No speech, no dramatic throwing. This was private, the sort of unremarked forgiveness that the frontier often knows how to give quietly. He pressed the earth down until the medallion was no longer a thing you could find. The act of burial was not an erasure. It was a burying of the weight that had prevented him from being present. He did not think the memory would leave him. Scars are not soil's mercy. But in tucking the medallion away, he made room for a different kind of truth, that the place he stood now asked of him not the currency of guilt, but the currency of care. News of Rodrigo's trial moved in the ways news moves on the frontier, slow as a cart and then instantaneous as a rumor. He had resources and he tried, predictably, to buy his way out with lawyers and with the insinuation that a town should not criticize a man of his station. But those who had witnessed Miguel's aggression and had seen Guillermo's steadiness did not forget. Witnesses came forward.
Don Felipe spoke plainly at the hearing, not with sentiment, but with exact, unglamorous facts. Who had done what, who had been present, what the town had seen. The indictment stuck to Rodrigo with the clumsy, efficient persistence of law finally catching up with a violence that had been obvious to those who had eyes to see. He was sentenced not to death, but to a measure of consequence that was enough to take him away from the easy use of force he had cultivated. He was removed from Santa Fael and escorted to a county seat, where his deeds would be accounted for in the external registers of the law. The town breathed a slow collective exhale and, in its doing, returned attention to the smaller matters of tending a home. In the months that followed, the ranch became the kind of place that accumulates ordinary miracles. The roof got a new ridge board, the porch was painted a stubborn pale that refused total blending into dust. Curtains were hung in the windows, simple pieces of cloth that moved like small flags, and rooms feel less like shelters and more like the carefully curated smallness of domestic life. A goat was bought and quickly became a center of gravity for certain mornings. Mateo watched it and clapped, which made Guillermo laugh in a way he had not in years. They planted more than beans. Tomatoes, a small orchard of saplings, and a square of herbs turned the yard into a place that smelled like a life being made, rather than a life merely hung on. Romance, if it had a course in that place, ran like a river in slow channels. It was not the quick bloom of melodrama, but the slow recognition of safety. There were mornings when Vanessa would rise and find bread warm in the oven because Guillermo had learned to bake in a way that impressed Don Felipe. There were nights when Guillermo would sit with Mateo on his knee and make up small songs that were half Spanish lullaby and half the odd words of a man who had learned to use his voice as a place to hold. There were moments where Vanessa would watch him in a light that made him look younger than his years and older in a way that suggested a life that had been deepened rather than merely punished. Then came a day in late summer when Mateo, plump and round with the soft, miraculous business of being a child, sat on the porch steps and found speech. It came not as a ceremony, but as an arrival, a small, bright syllable that bent like a reed. "Pa," he began, and he looked over at Guillermo with the serious face of a person making a decision about language. The word was not yet formed as a title or a claim. It was an exploration of what a voice could make. Guillermo's throat tightened. The small syllable landed in the air like a coin placed softly in palm. "Da," Mateo finished, and then he clapped at his own success, as if proud of his own small invention. There was nothing solemn about the moment. It was a domestic miracle made of heated tea and the smell of biscuits.
Guillermo bent, and his hands, those hands that had been marked by years of work and by the slow attempt to repair a life, came to cup the child's face, with an instinct that had learned tenderness. "Mateo," he whispered, and in that whisper was a claim that carried the weight of a man who had chosen to stay. Neighbors learned, little by little, to call to the child over the fence, and to carry greetings with a new warmth. Don Felipe would bring stories of planting to the porch, and then hesitate and say something about having a grandson of his heart. Doña Carmela would still dance with gossip, but had less venom. The sheriff visited and asked after the family, and his questions carried a gentler edge than they had months earlier. The town's hearts had reconfigured themselves around what had become obvious. A man who elected to protect a woman and a child, and who then mended the life around him, is a man who asks to be stayed.
Guillermo never made a grand speech. He met favors with favors, labor with labor. When the harvest that year was thin, he traded still. The county did not owe him anything. He learned to repair shoes for neighbors and took in small practical debts that were paid in kind. His nights were often clear and star-heavy. Sometimes he would sit and wonder aloud about the woman and the child at his side. He dug the ground deeper where the medallion lay. He let some roots take hold where once there had only been memory. He learned to hold Mateo not as a symbol, but as a person, and in doing so he allowed himself to be shaped by the small miracles of diaper changes and early coughs, and the first fever that frightened Vanessa enough to pace through the night. The baby's presence changed the contours of the ranch, as if a steady weather had arrived to coax life out of a place long accustomed to famine. Curtains were replaced, a spare chair came to the porch, the barn gained a new slat that made it sing less at high winds. The little garden produced enough for the table, and a small row of herbs that Guillermo guarded as if they were talismans. He taught Mateo, who grew into toddlerhood with the slow honesty of frontier children, the names of plants and how to watch the clouds for rain. Mateo's earliest lessons were not lectures but practice: how to feed a goat, how to hold a horse's bridle, how to watch the gathering of neighbors who came when the horizon promised rain. There were moments, quiet and small, when Vanessa would surprise them both by laughing wholly and without reserve. The laugh came sometimes when Guillermo sang half the lullaby badly and then corrected himself, or when Mateo ate a lemon rind and made a face like a small stunned philosopher. They learned to speak of the past without letting it anchor them. Vanessa would mention Rodrigo as one of many things that had once been part of a life she'd left, and Guillermo would listen without altering his face.
He held grief for himself like a bowl, and she respected the way he tended it. The town's defense of them was not a one-off heroism, but a living thing. There were times when men from San Rafael came to help with a fence or a roof. Don Felipe became an almost ceremonial presence, bringing tools and lending his voice to the idea that what had been built should be protected. The sheriff's visits were routine, casual as a neighbor's, not because Rodrigo had been forgotten, but because the law had been applied and the town had chosen a course. That course was not clean, in the sense of unblemished. There are always small slights and impatience, but it was steady, and there is worth in steadiness in a frontier life. Guillermo did not, in the months that followed, try to cross the county line with a different name. He considered leaving sometimes, not as a means of escape, but as a way to seek quieter ground for a child who might someday need less complicated histories to live in. Then he looked at Mateo's hand, the small fist that gripped his thumb, and at Vanessa's face when she slept with the light of a lamp at her throat, and he realized that the reparation he had to make was not away from this place, but here, by work and by tenderness. The medallion remained buried, the hole was covered, and the earth settled over it like a small secret of the land. Autumn brought hard blue light and the small triumph of a harvest that wasn't entirely wasted by drought. They sold cream and eggs at the market, and the money bought more than it should have: curtains, a new kettle, a set of tin cups that clinked familiarly every morning. Mateo learned to run short distances and to call the goats by name. He called Guillermo Pa sometimes, and the sound knitted new things in a man who had once thought his life only a ledger of absences. The line of their life was not straight. There were nights when old memories knocked on Guillermo's ribs, when the smell of something, charred rope, a wind that carried the weird echo of heat, set him back into a place of ache. He would sit by the fire and press his thumb along the blank metal of the space where the medallion had lain when he wore it. He would feel for the absence as if it were a body part. He told Vanessa less about the exactness of the fire's timing than about the way loss changes how men hold their fists. She listened and understood the kind of silence grief commands, and she matched him with her own disclosures about the day she fled Rodrigo's house, the way she had packed a blanket, the unsent letter that sat in a drawer for months, the sensation of looking over a shoulder and counting the distance. Their love was not the sort that appears in a single declared afternoon. It was a set of choices, a retinue of small favors, of nights stayed awake with fevered children, of hands that learned to do the particularities of repair.
At the courthouse, under the town's watchful eyes, and in a room that smelled of immigrants' papers, the sheriff recorded Guillermo's name as a man present to protect a child and a wife.
The act was not legal theater of triumphant ownership. It was the formal reflection of the work he had already done. He had not won some prize for valor. He had, by staying, earned the right to be counted. They moved at the pace of people who had learned to watch and to act. Mateo grew, tenacious, curious, stubborn in the way of children who survive on the frontier. He found pleasure in small chores, and his laughter warmed the house like a new coat. He said his first full sentence on a September morning when a chicken escaped the pen, and he managed to coax it back by offering a small piece of bread and then declaring himself the bravest boy of the yard. Guillermo laughed until his sides ached. Vanessa kissed the boy's brow in a motion so tender that it made even Don Felipe's eyes soften. The medallion was left buried in a place the grass had relearned to cover. Sometimes, late at night, Guillermo thought of what else he might have buried: anger, grief, the appetite to flee, and he hoped the soil had some blessing to offer. He did not need the medallion to mark his memory. The memory sat like a small, steady lamp in his chest. At times he would tell Mateo, without all the weight of the precise words, about the idea of home. Home is a place you build, he would say. It is not something you find by running. It is work and kindness and being there when the small things need help. Years passed with the decisive slowness of seasons. The ranch's paint held better than it had when Vanessa first arrived. The porch no longer sagged in one corner. They had curtains of blue in the bedroom and a quilt, patched from Don Felipe's old shirts, that Mateo claimed as his fortress. There were small community festivals where the town gathered, and where the couple sat in the warmth of being among neighbors who had become friends. Doña Carmela still had her small, sharp tongue, but she saved it for other townsfolk now. The sheriff would come by to trade stories and to procure eggs, and in those visits you could see how a lawman's ledger can be altered by the daily acts of a man and his family. On an ordinary morning, as dust motes swam like lazy fish in the light, Guillermo sat outside with Mateo on his knee and Vanessa at his side. The baby they had once feared to protect now ran barefoot to the garden and called for water as if he had always had claim to the land. Guillermo's hands, which had once been quick to keep the world moving by running from it, now rested with a confidence that had been earned by the slow arithmetic of being there. He had not been absolved by a clean miracle. He had been remade by stubborn fidelity. There was a small finality to the way things settled.
A home is never finished. There are always roofs to mend and fences to fix, and storms that will force a reevaluation. But there is a difference between a life kept together by fear and one kept together by the things people do to protect each other. For Vanessa, the wound of the past remained. Silence preserved some of its shape. But in the small glowing of the morning, with Mateo practicing to whistle, and with the smell of coffee setting a simple kind of breakfast, there was a kind of peace that is neither loud nor easy to claim, but is real in the small acts of life. Guillermo placed his palm on the worn wood of the porch and felt the pulse of a place that had been reclaimed, not by law alone, but by the steady hands of a man who finally learned how to be present. He thought of the medallion, buried and unclaimed. He thought, too, of the small miracle of a crib that had once been crafted from a plane and a saw. He had chosen to stay, and that choice had remade him. He had not become a different man by magic. He had become a man who woke up each morning and did the work that love sometimes requires. At noon, Mateo came and threw himself into Guillermo's lap, his face streaked with the soil of a life being lived. "Pa!" he shouted, and the call folded over the yard like a small banner. Guillermo laughed and lifted him high enough for the boy to shriek with glee. Vanessa watched them and felt a softness in her that was anchored not in forgetting, but in survival's careful mature, in the beauty of ordinary days. They had a small ceremony one evening when the sky was a slab of heavy, honest violet, and Don Felipe brought a new loaf of bread he had baked that afternoon. The three of them sat on the porch, father, mother, and small son, and watched the horizon. Guillermo took Vanessa's hand in his, and without the need for extravagant vows, placed it in a steady clasp. The medallion's absence was marked by the smallness of the place where he had buried it. It was a secret that had been told only to soil and to a few rocks. If the title of their saga had been about a secret that should never have been told, the truth of their life was that some secrets can be buried, and others must be lived into redemption. The secret of Vanessa's past had been a weight carried in the way of women forced to choose forks in the road.
The secret of Guillermo's past had been a burden of absence, a silence made of ash. Both had been revealed. Neither had the power to fully undo the damage. But in the space the two created together, something like a repair took hold. The baby, Mateo, became the small living reckoning of that possibility. When the sun dropped low and the porch lamp came to cast a thin globe of light, Guillermo hummed the same lullaby he had stumbled through on that first terrible night. He had learned all the words properly now.
Mateo's eyes grew heavy and closed. Vanessa leaned her head against his shoulder and breathed in the smell of coffee and baked bread and the small, stubborn sweat of work. The desert outside breathed too, and its sharpness was softened by the man-made things of cloth and sound and the company of neighbors. If the road had been long and uncertain, the house at last had shapes that suggested permanence, curtains that flittered, a repaired roof, a garden that fed. Don Felipe would sometimes sit and call Mateo his grandson, and the sheriff would pop in to ask if they needed anything, in exchange for a story of the county's news. Doña Carmela, who had once been a gossip, found herself at the gate handing over preserves. The town had been remade the way towns are remade, by people deciding who they wish to be. Guillermo had made a choice that could have been the bravest or the simplest, to stay. It cost him the illusion of distance he once prized, and gave him instead an honest possibility, a family formed of hands and quiet choices. In the late light, as the porch chair creaked with the weight of him, and the night folded around them, he gently held Mateo's small fist and pressed it to his own chest. The space that had been a map of loss was slowly being redrawn as a map of care. If anyone ever asked how the thing had turned out, how the woman's child found safety, how the lonely cowboy quit wandering, how the secret that should never have been told did not end them, there would be no single neat answer. There would be a tapestry of small acts, the repairing of a gate, the improvisation at a birth, the refusal to run, the burying of a talisman of grief, the town's choice to stand. That is how most things are saved, not by one grand gesture, but by 100 small decisions made in the grain of day-to-day life. On a final morning of a long summer, when the sun gilded the porch and the distant hills were blue and forgiving, Guillermo stood with Vanessa and Mateo and looked out across the land they had chosen to hold. He had once thought the desert would punish them for staying. Instead, it had taught them a thing a softer world often forgets, that steadiness matters. He sealed his hand around Vanessa's and watched Mateo run to the goat, a small man in a small world practicing the art of being alive. If this tale moved you, like and subscribe for more.